Hey everybody, it's good to be with you today. This is a short video on the process that is used when research projects are performed in marketing. So just to kind of get to it, in research, we want to use a fairly scientific approach oftentimes to get information, analyze it, interpret it, and then be able to present the findings and be able to offer some advice for whoever our client is. And so in marketing research, there's a set of steps that are fairly well defined. Now, what you're going to see is in this video, there's going to be a 5-step sort of grouping of things that are done. First of which is defining the objectives of the research. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail here in a second. But please know that depending on the research textbook that you look at or the pedigree of the researcher, there's going to be a lot of steps involved in each one of these stages. So think of like defining the objectives of research as a stage that has 3 different steps in it. If you go into marketing research, one of your studies will be this deep study of all of these activities. Here, what we do is just offer an overview of these steps. And again, we're going to go into these in a little bit more detail. So I want to offer you this idea that while we're going to look at 5 stages, defining the objectives, defining or designing the research, collecting data, analyzing the data, and then reporting, there are any number of smaller incremental steps that make up each one of these stages. So it's not necessary for you to know all these 11 steps, for instance, that you see on the left-hand side. But I do want you to know that the process of doing research can be very narrowly defined into a lot of little micro processes. What we're going to do is just look at an overview, just to give you a flavor for what it is. But the research process is something that if you do research a lot, so say you're a researcher and you're doing 20 projects a year, you're going to find it better to have a process so that you do each of the 20 projects essentially the same way. You just follow a process for each one. Now, the results and what you deliver to your customer, your client, will be different for each of the 20 projects, but your fundamental process for doing them will be the same. And that's what we want to talk about a little bit when we talk about this research process. So step 1, and we'll talk about this a bit, defining the objective. So what we want to do is we want to ask and understand what exactly we're trying to solve from a business perspective. What is the client's problem? What do we need to, what do they need to know? And is this a serious problem? Is this an important problem? Is this a problem that is going to impact their business in a great way? There are all these questions that we want to kind of know about before we ever begin. And this is usually done through an interview that you have directly with the client or the manager who's asking for this research to be done. Bear in mind that research is expensive. So when you ask for research to be done, it's going to come at a cost, a monetary cost. Somebody has to pay for it, but also a time cost as well. So there's this idea of the value of the information that you're going to get to make a decision versus the cost you're going to have to incur to have the research done to do it. And is it worth it? Is it worth doing that? So those are things to ask right away. Next, we want to think about actually defining the problem and being very, very clear that we are working with our research team maybe to really understand what the problem is that we're trying to find the answer to. From this point on, a lot of research and a lot of work is going to go in to the project. And if you're not answering the right question, then all that research is probably not going to be worth really a lot to you, right? So you have to be asking the right questions and answering the right questions. Okay, and then finally, what we're looking at is once we identify the problem, we need to clearly state what we're going to do for research. Like, what will be the research that we do? What will be the anticipated outcomes of the research? Like, what will it look like when we're finished? What will be the deliverable that's expected of us? So we want to try to kind of do a lot of that early on. So we have sort of our objectives, what we want to accomplish with this research, and what problem, generally speaking, we want to answer from a business perspective. That'll bring us into step number 2, where we start designing the research. And so when we think about designing research, this is really the researcher side of the issue, where there's a lot of different ways to do research. There's a lot of different, and part of it is there's a lot of different types of data. There are a lot of different methods that are used to gather data. And we got to kind of think about what methods we're going to use, even up to what type of analysis we're going to run that will ultimately answer the problem or answer the questions that the problem has presented. Right? So we need to determine what type of research and what type of data there is. So you're going to learn that there are 3 broad types of research, I guess. And so one would be something called exploratory research, where we maybe don't know very much about the topic. We don't know very much about the domain of the research. So we need to learn what is already available to us. We need to learn, it's the early stages of a research project. Is kind of what we're doing. We're collecting a lot of information that might come from interviews and from focus groups. We're not really doing a lot of statistical testing or anything like that at this point. We're just trying to get background information for this topic. Descriptive research, on the other hand, is when we have data where we're going to do some statistical analysis, and we want to produce results that describe the phenomenon in which we're studying. So, maybe we want to describe consumers, or describe when consumers buy, or why they buy, or how they buy. Those types of questions are oftentimes ones we might do some interviews, we might do some focus groups, but we also might do some surveys as well, where we get quantitative, like number data, along with that qualitative data that we're looking at as well. The last type of research we can do here is something called causal research, where we gather data and we do analysis, statistical analysis, and what we're looking to do is find relationships between variables, cause and effect types of relationships, and we want to measure those effects, and then we want to make predictions from them. So it's like a predictive type of research. We're not describing, but we're actually showing how one variable or one action will impact other things that we do. Okay, so that's causal. So at this stage, we're really designing, kind of thinking about, again, the methods, the type of research we're going to do. We'll talk about what type of data we're going to need. I've used this term quantitative a couple times. We talk about quantitative data. It's data that is mostly numeric. Ones that we sometimes will call it structured, in the sense that when we ask a question, we give the respondent a certain set of answers, and they choose one of the answers that best fits their response. So structured data, you see this in surveys or in data sets that might be in Excel or something like that. Qualitative data is the other type of data that I've mentioned, and it comes from verbal responses or observations. So we could do methods that involve gathering comments from customers, or gather, we'll ask them questions and they'll tell us in words what their response is. We record those, and then we analyze that type of data. Now that's very different from numbers. It's not number-based analysis, so it's not going to be statistical for the most part. We'll have to use other techniques to kind of analyze it, but it also gives us a different perspective from our respondents. Okay, another way to think of this idea of, oh, sorry, I forgot. We have this one other slide, and then we're going to do something else. So as we do this, again, we're designing our research. Qualitative versus quantitative. I think I've mentioned these already. Quantitative research, surveys, experiments. When you see the word scanner, it means like when you go through a register, the cash register scans the barcode and then records that. Well, that's data that's put into a database. So we go through the checkout, and every time we push an item across the scanner, it calculates how much we owe at the cashier, but it also stores that information so that we can study that and we can know what purchase habits are like. So those are quantitative. Qualitative, as I mentioned, when we're observing folks, when we're asking questions, that's the way, those are the methods that we'll use to get that type of data. Okay, back again, and I was jumping the gun a little early because I was so excited about unstructured and structured data. This is a good example of unstructured data is when you don't know the response. You don't know what you're going to hear. You don't know what the respondent will do. Here's a question we're asking about shampoo. And what are the most important characteristics of choosing shampoo? And it's an open box for the customer or the respondent to just write in whatever they want. That's qualitative data. That's unstructured. Down below, we have a more numeric-based thing where rate the importance of these attributes, and customers or respondents would rate them on a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 scale that's labeled from very unimportant to very important. And that's structured in the sense that for each one of these attributes, we know they're going to either choose a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So in other words, their answer is predetermined in structured data. In unstructured data, it's not. Okay, step number 2. Or as we move along here, when we think about this process of designing the research, it also includes understanding where the sample is going to come from, if that's in fact what we're doing. So usually we have to choose who's going to give us our answers. So if you're not doing a census, you're going to do a sample. And 99.999% of all research is based on a sample as opposed to a census. So how do we choose who is going to complete our survey? How do we choose who we will talk to in an interview? That's all this notion of sampling. And so this is kind of a convoluted, lots of arrows going on here. You can pause this if you want. But generally speaking, we have the group of people who could respond, and we define that as our population of interest. And then we select, and we use a selection method to choose who out of that population could take our sample, or could take our survey, or be interviewed by us. That's the sample frame. The people who actually do participate, the people who fill out the survey, the people who accept our invitation to have an interview is our sample. And then each individual respondent in there is a sample unit. Okay. Along the way, there's a little bit of error that happens, which is, kind of something that we talk about at other stages. But this is part of the design. We have to design. We have to think through how we're going to do our research. We're going to think through what the data will look like, what the data will be, whether it be structured or unstructured. We'll think about the methods we'll use to collect the data, survey, interview, those types of things. We'll also think about who will actually participate in the research. Who will the sample be? How many do we need? And where will they come from? And how will we acquire them? So that's actually a really, really big part of the design work. But it's all goes together. So this step 1 and step 2, we haven't actually done any research yet, but we've planned the research. And this is a huge amount of the actual actual process. Okay, step 3, collecting the data. So again, if you haven't already selected your sample, you need to select your sample. We also need to select the method that we're going to use to collect the data. I might have said that we're going to use a survey. We could call people up on the phone. We could send them the survey on the internet. We could do a paper and pencil survey, which we mail to them. We could see them. We could just do what's called a intercept, where we stand in a busy location, and as people walk by, we ask them to take our survey. All different ways to collect the data. And so we have to kind of think that through and identify how that's going to do. We also have to think about the process that we're going to do the data collection as well. And that's called it's called a protocol in order to collect the data. So again, collecting the data. We'll also, in this stage, think about how we actually design the instrument. So if we're doing a survey, we have to write the questions and we have to write that survey up, so we have the instrument to design as well. Step number 4, it leads us to the idea of analyzing the data. So we have to take the data and we have to kind of clean it up. We have to prepare it. We have to make sure it's in a database or in a medium that we can analyze it in, right? So, and then we have to start analyzing it. So we could do summarizations if it's verbal data or if it's that unstructured data. We could do some statistical analysis where we do some descriptions. We do averages and means and things like that for descriptive research. And then we also can do things like regressions and correlation analysis. We can also do something called structural equation modeling, a whole bunch of other techniques that measure cause and effect, right? So we have to analyze. So again, we're kind of thinking about this as we're doing our process. We designed the research, we've collected the data, now we're analyzing the data. Here's a little example that we do when we analyze the data and start to develop some understanding of what it's saying and what it means. Look at this real quick. This survey data. This was on, it looks like a 5-point scale where 5 is probably very high and 1 is probably very low. And we've got 2 different brands. We have Wendy's and McDonald's. So these are 2 different brands that compete with each other. And it looks like this is the perception that customers have of these brands on these 3 different qualities or dimensions: cleanliness, taste, and price. Low price is a good thing, right? So you want to be high on a low price. Taste is a good thing, so you want to be high on taste. Cleanliness is obviously a good thing, so you want to be high on that. So we look at this, and the insights that we have here is, okay, both brands are perceived as equal in cleanliness, but Wendy's is perceived as having better taste, while McDonald's is perceived as being better in low price. So as a manager, how do I interpret this, or how should the researcher interpret this for the manager? And a couple of things you can do is, hey, well, if you're doing advertising in your Wendy's, you should really push your flavor and your taste. If you're advertising for McDonald's, you should really push your low prices. If you want to gain more customers and better customer satisfaction, if you're Wendy's, you should work on your pricing. If you want to gain customers and add, better, be a better product, if you're McDonald's, you should work on your taste. That's kind of the interpretation. You'll get strengths and weaknesses. This is one way you can kind of turn this into ways that the client can benefit from the research and then gain more sales, get more market share, all those things that you would want to do, from a business perspective. So that's kind of like it's not, the part of the researcher's job is doing the research, collecting the data and analyzing, but another part of the job is interpreting the data and helping the client better understand what the data is saying for their business situation. Okay, last step, and we finish here. The last step is really this idea of reporting. This text talks about, and kind of this illustration talks about developing or implementing an action plan. Again, kind of describing how the data should be put into action to solve a problem. But at the end of the day, you're creating a report. Sometimes, or in many, many cases, you're actually presenting a report, which could be as short as 10 minutes or as long as an hour maybe. And you're walking through your research and you're describing how the research is important. If you're writing a report, you might use an outline kind of like this, where you create a summary, you give a report, you have conclusions. Limitations are something that we do special in research. A limitation is when the data is not perfect, we want to try to explain why. And that's called a limitation. Okay, so that would be the action plan. Okay, so again, we're going to wrap this up. Understand and know that there's multiple steps that are involved in research. Be sure you can name and put into order these 5 stages of research that we've talked about today. Understand and be able to describe exploratory, descriptive, and causal research. Know the definitions and the concepts of qualitative, quantitative data. Understand this idea of samples. Samples come from a population of interest, and they go from there. The textbook will describe and explain this concepts of error, so helpful to look at those. Understand popular data collection methods, so how you go about collecting the data, and be able just to talk about how the data can be analyzed to make decisions, and this idea of the research report. Okay, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for tuning in. I'll touch base with you soon.